Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. My name is Will Schmenner, and I'm for maybe a few more weeks, the new, pretty soon I'll have to stop saying new, but I'm the new head of public programs here at the Clark. It's my pleasure and joy to very briefly introduce our Associate Curator of Contemporary Art, Robert Wiesenberger. I'm fast becoming very enamored with his curatorial practice, and I think I'm allowed to say this, all this is being recorded. He's my favorite partner in crime here when it comes to programming projects. This is a really exciting show, and I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards about some of the exciting programs that are coming up, but we'll get to start the programming for this amazing exhibition with Robert Wiesenberger's talk. So please join me in welcoming our Associate Curator, Robert Wiesenberger.
Thanks, Will, for that kind introduction and also for programming the lively and unexpected pairing of a lecture and live music. I love it, and I hope some of you will join me in heading up the hill after this. As for the unexpected and I hope lively pairing at the heart of this exhibition, I want to thank a few people who helped to make it possible. There's the project team at the Clark, Teresa and Kathy, Jessica and Kevin, Paul, Tom, Nathan, Frank, Tim. There are the Williams student researchers who intersected with this project at various points very helpfully. They are Mallory Cohen, Mariana Fernandez, Jake Gagne, and Aidan Pham. And I also want to thank the generous supporters of this exhibition, Agnes Gund, Catherine and Frank Martucci, Thomas and Lily Beischer, Margaret and Richard Cronenberg. And finally, my deepest thanks to the artists themselves, Tauba, Auerbach, and Yujiyagamatsu, for the privilege of working with them. And as a program note, I also want to mention that Tauba will be speaking here on Thursday, October 6th, and Yuji will be here in conversation on Sunday, October 16th. So in this talk, I want to discuss each artist in turn. They're very different artists, and each up the hill have their own galleries, insulated by a very wide corridor between them. And then as an addendum, I want to discuss the meander as such, the term I'm willfully and playfully equivocating on in this pairing. The meander is an ornamental form, and you can see it here on the cover of our exhibition publication, a special issue of the journal, The Serving Library Annual. And it famously appears on the Anthora classic New York City coffee cup designed in 1963 that you're seeing here. It's a creative misspelling of amphora, the ancient Greek vessel depicted on the side. And the meander, which is also known as the Greek fret or key and by many other names, is named for the serpentine path of the Meandros River, which is now in Turkey. But it's also a global, culturally chameleonic form and one that persists. So I'll try to draw out some common threads between the two artists in this show. Specifically, their attention to flows of energy and matter at all scales, and to rhythms, continuities, and deep structures, and the ways they each oscillate between intuition and analysis, entropy and order, difference and repetition, the quotidian and the cosmic. Separately, in a brief addendum, I'd also like to argue for taking the meander seriously, and maybe even recuperating it from some of its ideological baggage. I'd like to propose seeing it not just as motif, but as a method and a model, a form, but also a way of thinking and moving. My approach to this motif, which is ubiquitous and ancient, and yet strikingly neglected in the literature, is not traditionally art historical, if I can say that at this lectern. Maybe it's in the tradition of the somewhat obsessive research on forms and symbols practiced by designers/artists like Jacqueline de Jong or Bruno Minari or others. In any case, I'll try to move briskly, and I'd welcome any discussion at the end, either here in the auditorium or on our way up the hill together. Let's start here. Tauba Auerbach was born in 1981 in San Francisco and lives and works in New York City. They studied visual art at Stanford, apprenticed afterward in San Francisco as a sign painter, which will be relevant momentarily. They work in a range of media, including painting, drawing, weaving, glass, musical instruments, typography, and books. And among all of those, they're highly engaged with craft, making things themselves when possible, and with making as an embodied way of knowing. What you're looking at is what I received when I asked the artist for a headshot to include on our website, and it's a beautiful photo they made, if also somewhat cryptic. But if you want to see Auerbach, they're often attending a table of their own wares at an art book fair, which is how I first encountered the artist. In 2013, Auerbach established the Diagonal Press, a project whose mission is to make art in the form of publications. These include books, posters, and various kinds of ephemera. They are open editions, unsigned and unnumbered, and they're sold at prices that are extremely reasonable. So I want to start with this book, which is featured in our show and is, as we speak, in the throes of its 5th edition to come soon. The full title is a mouthful, but also quite descriptive: A Partial Taxonomy of Periodic Linear Ornament, both established and original, arranged by shape, symmetry, dimension, iteration, and projection. So this is Tauba's research on indirect lines that repeat at intervals, also known as curves, waves, frets, keys, or meanders. In mathematics or ornament, these are often called self-avoiding lines, a designation the artist rejects as they think that, in fact, this is a way for a line to be very close to itself, a kind of intimacy for the line. So some of the lines included here are well known as ornamental forms or fractal mathematical curves. Others are invented by the artist. And in the process, they are iterated, extruded, reimagined in 3 dimensions and sometimes in 4. I'll return to this book, but I want to zoom out and note the background for it. So I'll click through a few screenshots from an artist's talk that Auerbach gave. And what you're seeing are meanders in architecture and textiles in the Americas, Europe, Asia, and beyond. And Auerbach likes to speculate on this global, independently developed form with which we adorn our buildings, our objects, and ourselves. And they ask why it persists, and they suggest that it's not for a lack of human creativity, but rather for deeper and more resonant reasons. So Tauba follows these lines closely, and these are examples of the body of work that's present in our show. These are called ligature drawings. And here they are together up the hill. These are made with chisel-tip markers or brush-tip pens, and they are curves, some existing, some invented, and made in a state of flow. Tauba uses the skills of sign painting, that is to say, a combination of precision and speed. If you move too fast, you mess up. If you move too slow, the line is belabored and doesn't have that smoothness of flow, and often makes these in conjunction with movement exercises or with ambient music. Finally, each one is dated with a stamp, tiny rubber stamp, essentially invisible in these photos, with the day on which it was made. Tauba's goal is to understand these lines, the way they work. Tauba lives with the forms, imbibes them, embodies them. And this is, I'd suggest, a kind of kinesthetic knowing, to use the term of Zeynep Çelik-Alexander, who describes it as a non-discursive and non-conceptual knowledge, gathered from the body's experiential exchanges with the world. For Auerbach, this way of knowing through movement and making is combined with extensive conceptual research into mathematics and physics. The two work as often in tandem. The series title, Ligature, connects Auerbach's multidisciplinary interests between form and gesture. A ligature is the line that connects letters, whether in handwriting or typography. It connects musical notes in notation. And in surgery, it ties tissue together. In this series of paintings, which is on the opposite wall upstairs, these are known as the grain paintings. And there is here a mixture of knowledge and gesture as well. The way Tauba makes them is very typical of the artist in that they're using an age-old medium of painting, but inventing a tool. That tool is a kind of roller that is impressed with a silicone mold bearing ornamental lines or fractal mathematical curves. So what Tauba does is they spray the canvas with multiple layers of acrylic paint and then graze it in one fell swoop with this roller tool. So this is a subtractive process. There's nothing on the roller when it's applied, and when it's removed, there's the residual paint. And what you're seeing then are layers beneath the surface. This process registers the direction, force, speed, and movement of the artist. And it takes, and I can show you in this particular case, you can see embedded in the title here is a reference to the Sierpinski curve, a fractal mathematical curve, one version of which looks like this. So there's clearly a very wide gulf between this form and this finished painting. But Tauba is taking a precise rectilinear, fixed, and flat form and rendering it painterly, dynamic, dimensional. Transforming it, usually beyond recognition, into quivering, seemingly emergent forms. And I'll show you a few more here. Grain, the series title, is named for a graining tool, which is traditionally used to make fake wood grain or faux bois, common in the 19th century decorative arts, but used still today. It looks like a little rubber tool with regular concentric rings on it, but when applied to a surface and pressed and rolled and rocked, it creates the irregularity that appears as wood grain. But for Tauba, this is also a suggestion of the grain of the universe. Its structure is revealed, a kind of signature, in their words, a collective automatic writing. Here are the paintings together. So I want to ask where we might situate this artist. It's a kind of question that artists often don't like, and historians often do. But this is work, this work and Tauba's other manifold objects that they create, diverse objects in all media, outwardly presents, in many cases, as op art, the tendency in post-war geometric abstraction that was concerned with illusionism and perception. You can think of Bridget Riley or Victor Vasarely or others. But there's also, as I've described, a focus on process, on combining parts in a scientific fashion that's reminiscent of constructivism, whether from the 1920s through to the post-war period. But as well, there's this interest in the body and gesture. So one connection I want to draw out that is really motivated by the artists themselves is to Joseph Albers. And I mention him, again, because Tauba does, and not because of the way the artwork looks. And in this case, you're not looking at artwork, but rather Albers's landmark book, The Interaction of Color. And for Tauba, the model of Albers is in his sensitivity and subjectivity of, as an artist, in a context, a guide to color, which is, implies a scientific set of questions, in which the artist allows their subjectivity and sensitivity to carry the day, and consequently has created one of the most enduring and, to Tauba's mind, effective guides to color. Here, too, the interest in testing and iteration and multiple editions and attempts is something that guides both of them. It's an ethos that exists in design, that exists also in science. And it's also what Tauba is doing in turn in their work. So as Albers's colleague, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, would say, that the artist is the grindstone of the senses. And for both of them, Moholy and Albers and Tauba too, this is not just about the sense of sight, but also about the tactile and the embodied as well. So maybe coincidentally, and maybe not, Joseph Albers was also a major champion of the Meander in his teaching. So you're looking at the stepped fret common in Mesoamerican art, known in Nahuatl as Zikal Colloqui. That means twisted gourd, though it's thought to represent water, waves, and cyclical forces. And Albers wrote in his book Search versus Research, which, as the title suggests, is very much about a preference for the first term over the second, for empiricism, experiment, as opposed to knowledge of concepts. In it, he writes about the meander. Quote, because of its name, Greek key, or meander, it's considered of Greek origin. Factually, we find it all over the world, revered in almost all cultures, east and west, very early and very late. Most developed, he observes, is the meander among the indigenous peoples of the Americas, in architecture, sculpture, painting, and especially in the arts of weaving and pottery. And this reflects the import in indigenous cosmologies of recurrent cycles and cyclicality. Albers continues, quote, the meander deserves our special attention because it teaches us both basic drawing and basic design. As design, it represents a linear organization, at the same time very intricate and very simple. Intricate because of its figure-ground relatedness, in which figure and ground are simultaneously and alternately theme and accompaniment, thus guiding and following each other. So this is a reference in some ways to if you have an even line, that the figure and ground switch out in ways that in Gestalt thinking is called Gestalt switching between figure and ground. And so he assigned this form to his students, one of whom at Black Mountain College was Ruth Asawa, who in this case translates the assignment into a wave-like scroll that is varied and organic. Asawa also produced more rigid and rectilinear and classical meanders on the left, and one might see them, I do, as a kind of precursor to their very famous now woven hanging sculptures. So to return to partial taxonomy, Tauba iterates these forms, projects them, considers them in other dimensions. And in this, Tauba is working in the tradition, explicitly in this case, their connection, not mine, of Claude Bragdon, architect, stage designer, and math enthusiast. This is Bragdon's book, Projective Ornament of 1915. And in it, he laments the impoverishment of ornament in the present, that it wasn't very good and that it didn't express its time. And Bragdon notes that ornament could come in future from history, it could come from natural forms, or it could come from somewhere else. And that somewhere else that he posits is geometry, and especially the fourth dimension. So this is a kind of contrast to a very famous treatise on ornament, the Grammar of Ornament from 1856, in which Owen Jones famously turned to history, and especially the non-Western world, as a source for ornament. So this project, I'm only showing 2 pages of an extensive and lavishly illustrated volume, is about documenting and categorizing and observing the underlying structures of ornament, usually with a sort of colonial gusto. Even Jones acknowledges that Mexican and Greek ornament, as he titles them, should appear on facing pages and display what he calls a remarkable affinity between them in their frets. So this is a new edition of Claude Bragdon, published through the Diagonal Press by Tauba Auerbach from 2016. And as a publisher's preface to this book, which is otherwise faithfully reproduced, Tauba writes, quote, ornament is often mistaken for something superficial, meaningless and indulgent. But certain ornamental motifs have a particular resonance and have persisted throughout history, showing up in many parts of the world independently, enduring time and cultural change. I believe this is the case because they evoke essential natural structures, the wave, the vortex, the helix, and gestures, oscillation, and spin, and that these structures exist on every scale, even deeply inside of us. The Greek key or meander fret is a series of eddies, like those visible on the surface of Jupiter. So this form for Tauba is about movement and gesture, about flow, folding, and spin. And they categorize 2 types of symmetry, known as chirality or handedness, and the word comes from the Greek chair, for hand. Something is chiral if it can't be superimposed on its mirror image. So our hands, which may be mere images, can't be superimposed, at least in this dimension, in any way, whereas a circle or a square or a wine bottle could be. So as Tauba notes in dialogue with the writings of mathematician Martin Gardner, chirality is everywhere. It turns out our molecules are chiral, the helices of our DNA, and the collagen that forms fascia, our connective tissue. So this spin holds the universe together, holds us together. Elsewhere, Tauba observes that in architecture, there's often a distinction between tectonic, or structural, and atectonic, or ornamental, the applied, what's often thought of as the superfluous. But Tauba rejects that idea and posits a closer relationship between the two, between ornament and structure. Tauba believes that the two are closely related and that certain forms appeal to us because they express, certain forms, ornamental forms, appeal to us because they express rhythm and structure in a profound way. So in architecture, buildings stand thanks to the craft processes of folding and binding and sewing and turning, to joinery and screws and the molecular makeup of materials. And in this, Tauba improves on Gottfried Semper. I'm showing you here, by the way, speaking of chirality, you can see that in the Meander unit on the left, you can see the S described in it and the Z described in the facing one, and these ideas of opposite directions of rotation. So I mentioned Semper, which admittedly seems like a far cry from this work and a long shot, because he argued in this book, I really wanted to use the Amazon image here for this book, style, imagined here as a kind of t-shirt potentially, that decorative arts like weaving and pottery precede architecture in their development and sophistication, and we can learn from them about buildings, a kind of prehistory of architecture. So he sees a textile origin for architecture, making fiber and weaving into tents. So this is not about columns and beams, post and lintel, the classical explanation, but about soft structures and craft. So these textile origins are often expressed, Semper observes, in the ornament of buildings and the appearance of coiling and braiding and weaving. And so the meander on a building can also be read as a kind of textile artifact. So ornament here has a cultural function and represents material history. And Tauba, who's not in direct dialogue with Semper, the connection is one that I'm introducing, takes that down to the molecular level and up to the cosmic level. So in this work from Tauba from 2015, which is fairly low contrast, so I'm not sure it's visible, but you'll see maybe what I mean. And here's a detail of it. So in this case, this is a woven canvas on a stretcher. Tauba has manipulated the material support itself, reflecting weaving in an ornament that is about weaving. This is a work also about the operations and gestures that comprise it. And I was surprised, even after I'd formed this pet hypothesis, to see works like this from Tauba's back catalog, in this case, weaving expressing architecture. So there's an uncanny reflection here also on Ani Albers, who was likewise fascinated by the ruins of Oaxaca in Mitla and elsewhere, and who was also deeply invested in craft and direct tactile experience, and who called so-called women's work in the decorative arts the basis for the architecture and also art to come. As Ani Albers wrote in the essay The Pliable Plane, architecture's origins are in textile, and she argued against the specialization of knowledge and for a direct experience of materials. Quote, architecture and textiles seem to be antithetical, but both are based on constructing parts that retain their identity in a whole. So I wanted to observe, we do live in a very strange time that is ostensibly so divorced from ornament. I'm thinking of the famous screed by Adolf Loos in 1913 called Ornament and Crime, much of which was barely disguised bigotry aimed at so-called primitive decorative forms, deeming them degenerate. But in the scheme of things, it's relatively recent that humans have thought so little about ornament. And I want to argue that Loos was wrong for certainly many reasons, but for this one in particular, Part of his argument is about the futility, the foolishness, in the hope that we might be able to express ourselves, our inwardness, through outward ornament, and that a sophisticated modern human would never do that. But Tauba shows us that material expression and cultural expression and memory, as Zemper knew, are also embodied in our ornament. But moreover, and this is Tauba's distinctive contribution, there's also this cosmic expression about a profound sense of rhythm and flow, structure and spin. Okay, I want to switch to Yuji. And I might pick up the pace because I want to keep it moving. Yujiyagamatsu was born in 1956 in Kanagawa, Japan. He has, since the 1980s, lived and worked in New York. Among other sculptural, drawing, and photographic practices, he's best known for his daily wandering walks, his meanders, on which he collects objects from the street, places them into the cellophane wrappers of cigarette packs, and calls each one a zip. The name comes in part from the different zip codes that he visits, but also from the fact that he used to use small pill pouch bags, Ziploc bags. At that time, the register of the work was much more evidentiary, much more forensic, and in the meantime, with these cellophane volumes, it's become, in my mind, much more sculptural, but also much more animate, something closer to a terrarium that's teeming with life, a small world. So Yuji doesn't have any prescribed paths. He visits different neighborhoods. It's based on where he's living and the whims that day. And I'll show you some more of the works, 92 of which are up the hill in the Lunder Center. On each walk, he records a notebook entry across the page spread. On the left, you'll see his route with different intersections and local landmarks and annotations for what he found. So it may not be legible here, but you might be able to make out, for example, the broken glass, the asphalt, the green Ziploc bag, the broken pink balloon, the candy wrapper, but also the playgrounds, the construction site, and so on. On the right of the page, and so each spread is a day, is a kind of impression of the walk, very atmospheric, impressionistic, written in a combination of Japanese and English and wandering abstract lines. These are minute drawings. They're usually not legible to viewers of his work, but for this exhibition, we've collaborated with Yuzo Sakura to translate a few of them, and we've done that by silkscreening them on the wall. So, for example, what you're looking at on the right reads in part, quote, a breeze blows, but there's absolutely nothing soothing in it. All I can hear is rustling leaves of the trees swaying in the wind. Out of the blue, something catches my eye, and I touch it. I pluck a piece of rotten chewing gum, its gooey tactility. And that day, September 26th of last year, yielded this zip. The fork is indicated in his notebook with a little trident sort of sketch. Yuji calls this detritus, not trash. He thinks of trash as a violent epithet and suggests a kind of slippery slope once anything, or certainly any person, starts to be thought of as such. The zips are a tribute to New York City in a very specific way, not out of any special love for the place, but rather for the cosmopolitanism and pluralism of it. Yuji feels at home there, people let him do his thing, and they have come together in his neighborhoods in the various trying times, the present included. So he extends some of this courtesy also to things. He doesn't practice Buddhism, but cultivates an animist respect for the matter around him, even the smallest things. And whether or not these things are endowed with souls, they are of interest and due respect. So for Yuji, this project is about the metabolism of the city. This, too, is a kind of collective automatic writing of place. The natural and artificial are cheek by jowl and are all parts of the cycles of the place. The zips contain anonymous things that have been worked on by the elements or by people. They've been twisted or stamped, otherwise sullied. Some of these, as you'll see, are spare, others are full. That's based on the time available. And so in this way, Yuji is a kind of historian of the city from its unconscious side. He does this without nostalgia. There's only an appreciation for change. Yuji's interest is both aesthetic and anthropological. Aesthetic in the sense that I would submit that he's a colorist and a formalist and appreciates some of these serendipitous connections he finds, and an anthropologist in his deep interest in human habits and desires, the distinction between different neighborhoods and who lives there, and how on this subconscious level they live. As you can see, the works are usually shown in these acrylic boxes that are in the form of calendars mounted on the walls. In the exhibition at the Lunder Center, we've done something different in collaboration with the artist. You're seeing these here on concrete block plinths, 12 of them in all, one row for each month, July, August, and September of 2021. And the choice of material, which is Yuji's, is based on his desire for it to be less precious than a traditional museum plinth, for it to evoke the construction sites that he frequents, to nod to Tadao Ando's signature material, albeit poured concrete, but still the building in which the exhibition is staged, and also to create this grid that allows one to move stepwise through it, to meander, the grid being the essential technology of preserving difference that New York employs. And so here too there's a question one might ask about where to locate Yuji. And you can see here on the far wall are some of the silk-screened notebook drawings, greatly enlarged, and translated in the accompanying booklet. But he falls certainly into a tradition of other walking practices. The combination of surrealist and Dadaist tendencies that resulted in the Situationist International, active in the late 50s in Paris, that was really interested in this kind of playful spontaneity that worked against the grid, like Yuji, worked against efficiency and the dictates of capital. They employed a method of becoming lost in the city through what they called the dérive or drift, and connecting different parts of it, what they called a psychogeography. I would submit the meander, and this is maybe a finer point, is also about a more routinized way of moving, and also one that has less faith in chance than the Situationists did. And for that reason, perhaps, it's a useful way of thinking. Another obvious, probably too obvious, even facile comparison is the date paintings of Onkuwara, another strict rules-based conceptual practice, also with subtle variations in each one, but admittedly less interest in the objects themselves or the place. Yuji's work certainly falls into a tradition of assemblage, of combinations of unorthodox media, but the connection that I want to draw that may be less expected, except for those who know Yuji, is to Milford Graves, the late free jazz percussionist and visual and martial artist, all of whose work was about syncing up the rhythms of the body with those of creative practice. So Yuji studied Nara, the martial arts form invented by Graves, with him for many years. And in his work, in Yuji's and in Milford's, you'll see this improvisational tendency that things are found on the street, go into the cigarette pack, and essentially stay where they are. There's not a lot of post hoc composing. It's a highly rhythmic practice that is also akin to the kind of movement exercises of Nara, the way that Yuji, when he walks, and we walked together October of last year, is bobbing and weaving in a state of flow that I use the word advisedly, but has a meditative aspect. And finally, the way in which this is a life practice, that the imperative to keep moving is essential for Yuji. This line continues. So for Yuji, the meander is about drift. It's about the paths of people and things in the city. These are some photos of us walking together in Crown Heights. And it's about an aimless walk that's also highly routinized and regularized. A reminder that the meander is its own antonym. It suggests both the rote and the unreliable. It's about repetition and difference. It's about ebb and flow, boom and bust, growth and decay. So to close, I want to offer a brief addendum on the meander as such. It's certainly a basic form, literally near the base of the tree in this genealogical sketch by Walter Crane. You can see it at lower right, a very slight evolution of the repeated rectangular forms of the square that are linked here by a rhythmic line, and not so far from the spiraling scroll form across from it. And as ornament goes, it's nowhere near as dazzling as the fractal complexity of the Alhambra, which Owen Jones illustrated in an earlier volume. Nor is it as free as what was known as the Arabesque in 18th and 19th century European art, the wandering line that was the subject of an exhibition by my colleague Anne Leonard in 2019, and documented how this form moved from the periphery to the center of compositions, and for some critics who despised it, in her words, quote, fast overgrowing the borders like kudzu in a garden, the profuse decorations creep well into the text areas of the page, sometimes even taking them over. Still, I'm charting a movement from periphery to center, from ornament's role in merely framing and linking to the central subject of concern. But of course, it's also long been so. You can see in this Attic pottery, you can see in the Attic pottery of ancient Greece and its flourishing geometric period, in this pyxis or lidded jar, in which the meander is not just a border, but the main event. As Richard Neer has observed, the idea of ornament is always relative to a figure that it ornaments. But when it's just ornament, and ornament as figure, it may not be ornament anymore, but the subject itself. Here's another example of a proper amphora. So what does this subject come to mean? To make his entablature paintings and prints in the 1970s, Roy Lichtenstein went to Wall Street and Lower Manhattan to photograph the facades of buildings housing government and especially financial institutions. He focused here on the entablature, or the horizontal lintel supported by columns, often bearing running ornament in its frieze, in this case, the meander. He did this in part to poke fun at his minimalist peers, explicitly calling out Donald Judd and Kenneth Noland in his writing, by finding simple serial geometric forms in the ancient world. But moreover, Lichtenstein wanted to understand the language, as he said, of, quote, imperial power, end quote. He explained, and I quote, "This series can be seen to represent, in a humorous way, the establishment," end quote. And here he's playing on the similarity of the words establishment and entablature. He says, quote, "By establishment I mean that the reference in these entablature paintings was to the Greco-Roman tradition which permeates our art and culture," end quote. And of course, here we are. The Clark's founding building of 1955 is a white marble temple in neoclassical style, and I would submit an aspirational projection of its cultural authority and allegiances, as expressed by, to put it lightly, an arch-conservative founder. There's a lot to say about this projection of a noble, pure, and crucially white classical past, despite all evidence to the contrary of multi-ethnic societies and multicolor monuments, and the long afterlife of this thinking in ethno-nationalist movements today, but that's a different talk. Rather, we can start by being alive to this language of cultural authority that animates so many institutions and is in no way neutral. And we can see this particular form, long used for its ideological content, as global in reach. But that too is another talk. Rather, I've tried to alternatively present the meander as a kind of model, a way of thinking and moving for energy and matter, for people and things. So to zoom out, we can acknowledge that speaking of continuity and perpetuity is harder in the Anthropocene, a geological era defined by human impact on the planet, as so many natural cycles skip or stutter or fail. But continuity is also a useful frame, when apocalyptic thinking of a clear end or a hard stop might be more convenient. The line continues, with or without us. And that line may be a better illustration of history than we thought, not the upward tilt of progress, but the cyclical, the recurrence of regress, the ebb and flow. So I want to end by observing that to live on a planet that is dying, but to be alive and sensitive to deeper rhythms and structures and continuities, as both these artists are, is to see the meander all around us and to see in it a source of great beauty. Thank you. So So if there are any questions or comments or discussion, there are many people in the room who are more knowledgeable about these subjects than me, happy to take them, or we can take them in as we walk together up the hill. I see, yeah. And yeah, there's a microphone coming.
Hi, thank you so much. It was so informative, wonderful lecture. I wonder about Yuji's process. Does he pick up everything, or he just has a system of what he picks up? And also, everything that he arranges, I wonder how it reminded me of Ikebana. Everything is kind of like centered, rounded, has a irregular, like, so it just looks like bouquets to me, his arrangements. Do you have anything to comment on that?
Yeah, I was also curious about his method, and when we walked together, I was sort of trying to understand his criteria, so I found what I thought was a really interesting looking sort of braided cotton bracelet on the ground that was multicolor, and I said, is this good? I asked him, and he said, maybe great, but he kept moving. So he had designs on other things, and I've sort of tried to suggest some of the criteria that he has, as variable as the objects are, that there is this interest in the anonymous and the worked, that a discarded lottery ticket may be interesting, but one that's been twirled between someone's fingers and in anticipation and cast to the ground in disappointment, I mean, that's a story. And so there is this interest in human-inflected objects, ones that are anonymous. He's not picking up everything. As he puts it, the objects come to him. As for their composition, I mean, some of these really do feel very composed in terms of sort of asymmetric counterpoint and using the volume of the container, and others are full, overloaded, and he says, I think maybe a little bit glibly, that's just because some days he has longer to walk and more time. But I realized when walking with him that he takes the wrapper off the pack and puts it inside the box to give it some structure when it goes back into the breast pocket of his fisherman's vest. And consequently, when he's composing them, he's adding things from the top, so he only has a bird's eye view. And so he's adding bit by bit and sort of working his way up. So there is some interest in, I mean, he was really interested in the kind of the silicate, the beach beneath the street of kind of small matter that he would sort of lay down as a foundation and then things on top. But each piece is pretty different. So some, yeah, it's hard to derive a given rule from it, yeah. Are there other questions?
Thanks very much. How do you understand the status of capitalism in both artists' works? I mean, with the status of capitalism, I mean, with Yugi, it seems like it could be the detritus of the commodityscape, and with Auerbach, it could be, the design-permeated world. But is that there for you?
Yeah, that's a big one and a good one. Yeah, I mean, Yuji is collecting waste. He doesn't think of it as that, but the waste of a wasteful system. It's not a critical practice for him. I mean, he is ever an optimist. It's all part of this sort of cycle for him. I do think that there is, and maybe this, I don't know if this is where you're going, but sort of this rejection of the efficiency of capitalism, that to take the meandering way is to take the long way, and to sort of thwart the system. And in this case, he was doing these walks before or after work, and the work at that time was as a janitor at the 101 Spring Street Donald Judd Foundation, where he was dusting the minimalist sculptures of Donald Judd every day, and then later working as a home care aide for many years for Namjoon Paik. But that to the side, I think, yeah, it's a very non-judgmental practice for him, and he has a sort of aestheticized waste in a way, and accorded it a kind of respect. For Tauba, I think I need to separate the sort of understanding of personal politics from the work. There is, well, certainly the interest in artist books is a way of having an alternative practice to a fabulously commercially successful one in unique auratic objects like paintings and drawings and so on. And for Tauba, it was really important to align themselves with communities and friends and people they cared about and had direct relationships with by selling, books inexpensively that they had made themselves. So there is in that way a sort of a bucking of the art system. But as for these kind of the cyclicality of the form, I'll need to think more about that. It's a really good provocation, yeah.
We need the microphone for Zoom. It's really helpful.
Hi, Rob. Thanks for that excellent talk. I was curious to build on this, your response to this past question. How aware are these artists of each other's practices, and what were their thoughts, if any, about being paired together for this exhibition?
Is that you, Anne?
It is. Hi.
I can't see a thing. Anyway, I should credit Anne Thompson, who's shown here at the Clark, for bringing the first and still only copy of Partial Taxonomy to the Berkshires in the Bennington College Library collection. New edition to come soon. They're very different artists. They were aware of each other, but it was a connection that I had suggested and done so in part based on the floor plan of the gallery and a belief that they could coexist, and if someone walked in and saw it as two solo shows, that would be absolutely fine. Two shows side by side, and if someone wants to spend more time with it and draw their connections, that's fine too. I mean, I think I definitely don't harbor the illusion that this is like an inevitable pairing of artists separated at birth. I mean, it's a light linkage, but there are ways in the show in which spatially we've tried to sort of, because so much of it is about this collapsing of scales from the very small to the very large, and the fractal and so on. But from Tauba's, and I didn't show them, but huge wall scale, architectural scale wall coverings, wallpapers, down to a very small artist book, sort of concrete poem, and that's the last encounter with the Tauba object one has before moving to Yuji's gallery of small things. And the ligature line drawings on the side closest to the door also reflect a more irregular route. So there are those gestures, but I want to hold the two very lightly and acknowledge how different they are. And I want to add that the publication is also not a catalog, and the goal is to expand on this idea of the meander as a way of thinking and moving through different disciplines that are archaeological and neurological and narrative and literary. So there are many contributions that take that as a kind of prompt, again, based on the idea that a catalog would have been a bit forced. There's a question down here.
Thank you, Rob. Having missed the entire talk due to a little more traffic from New York than I expected, I'll hope to have a chance to catch up afterwards and hear what you said, and I'm sure brilliantly formulated. I'm curious now, having come to marking a point in what I know is a very long project for you, a long curatorial endeavor that includes this publication and this juxtaposition of artists. I'm just curious, what's next? Where does this take you next in your thinking, or what is it that you need or are curious about after this?
Thank you for the question. I think just based on the necessity of the schedule here, what's next is the next show, which is 3 things next year. One must keep moving, and this can't be a fixation for much longer. But it was for a time this kind of, almost obsessive fascination with this form that, as I mentioned, it's so ubiquitous, it's so present in material culture, it's all over the world, it's at the basis of the analyses that form, the foundation of art history, of sort of late 19th century writings about ornament, and yet there's so little written about that form as such, and let alone as like a way of sort of thinking. This may be the end of the line for me, but in the process, I've definitely encountered found some resonances with people who responded to it, and I think may carry it in different ways. So I think it will appear in other ways that I'm not yet sure of. Yeah.
I'm just going to follow up and feel free to answer as you see fit. But I'm curious, apart from the intellectual and the institutional, where does this leave you personally? Where do you think that what did you learn from this, and how do you think that carries forward in your own trajectory as a human?
Wow. Fair enough. Fair enough. I did end with a picture of the galaxy, so I should have expected. Yeah. I think I'm among other things, I'm left with a real faith in the ability of artists to think and feel and imagine things that scholars and scientists couldn't begin to, and to have found in an artist's practice that I admired such, on both sides, so much more depth than I expected. And so, I think, as is often the case, to like a thing and to figure out then why and to keep on digging is thrilling and rewarding. But yeah, and it's tricky as a modernist. What do I do now with this deep conviction about the value of ornament and specific kinds of ornament? But it's definitely a project that forced me also as a humanist to spend more time with the kind of mathematics that really intimidate me. So it certainly opened up new lines of thinking, but again, just this renewed faith in what artists are able to do and how they can make us see and think and feel with them into their work. Thanks, everyone.